Okay, good morning, everybody, and thanks for joining us for another SALISES virtual discussion forum. In this forum, titled Development Finance for a Low Carbon Caribbean Future Issues and Solutions, we have 5 academics who will be discussing various dimensions of the consequences and costs associated with climate change and the mechanisms that can be put in place to manage these costs. The discussion, I think, is quite timely given the recent completion of the 27th Conference of the Party Sessions in Egypt, where many themes present at various meetings were reiterated, but certainly with greater urgency. Among these themes is the constant concern for climate financing in developing nations, as island developing states that are highly exposed to climate risk, while at the same time having a negligible contribution to the main source of these risks, which is GHG emissions. These SIDs also typically face additional economic challenges that limit their response capacities to climate risks, especially as it relates to the financing of recoveries from extreme weather conditions and the financing of low carbon technology to support decarbonization transitions. The low carbon transition is a challenging undertaking, which involves several dimensions, including policy, technology, and financing response mechanisms, which are needed to create the pathways to a low carbon future. It is also important to recognize the need to adapt to the already changing environment, especially as it relates to extreme weather conditions in our region. Furthermore, at the policymaking level, it is important to design appropriate policies within their required spaces. These are all issues that have been argued in the Caribbean region, and today our panelists will engage several of these concerns through various conversation lenses. I look forward to the discussions, and I'm sure the audience will find them engaging and highly relevant to the broader climate change discussions. That said, I will turn over to Dr. Godfrey St. Bernard, Director of the SALISES St. Augustine, for his opening remarks. Dr. St. Bernard.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Dr. Stewart. And again, it gives me tremendous pleasure to bring remarks on behalf of the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute of Social and Economic Studies. And when I say the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute of Social and Economic Studies, SALISES, I'm really referring to SALISES Regional, because we have units on each of the 3 original campuses of the UWI, the University of the West Indies. We have units on the Mona campus, on the Cave Hill campus, and on the St. Augustine campus. We hail from the St. Augustine campus, and we take great pleasure in celebrating what SALISES is all about. SALISES is a development studies think tank in the Caribbean region, and we pride ourselves as being of international repute in terms of the work that we do and the training that we offer in our various programs. So today we are really here to again witness the 14th in our series entitled the SALISES Virtual Forum. And these forums constitute webinars where SALISES feels obligated to really bring issues, a wide range of issues that are akin to sustainable development processes, whether we are talking about the social, the economic, the cultural, the governance, and the environmental. And in many instances, when we witness and we deliver our forums, we treat with a lot of cross-cutting issues that even cut across these domains. So we are very pleased today to have the 14th, to host the 14th in our series. And we feel that this is an apt opportunity to really emphasize the important link between economics and economic thought, economic in action, and how those processes dovetail, so to speak, with issues that arise in the context of the environment. So we are very pleased to have had Dr. Stewart join our staff, and along with Dr. Priya Mohan, the 2 of them will represent SALISES in this particular offering in terms of making presentations. We feel quite strongly that whenever we have our forums, there ought to be a SALISES representation to ensure that the rest of the world knows that, you know, SALISES does have scholars, does have academics who can engage and deal and treat frontally with the issues that we have been addressing. Since the semester started in September, we have had forums looking at issues such as gun crime, gun violence in Caribbean societies. We looked at the budget statement that was read for Trinidad and Tobago, and SALISES felt compelled to respond to the budget statement that was read back toward the end of September in 2022. And our last forum looked at the whole issue of food security and sustainable development in Caribbean societies. And that was done in collaboration with the Caribbean Research and the Caribbean Agricultural Research and Development Institute. And that in particular was a really stellar event that scored major points from what we have heard by way of feedback. So we expect that today it's going to be no different. And last week, those of you who witnessed one of our other events, the SALISES Spotlight Lectures, where each academic in SALISES gives a spotlight lecture on his or her specific area of academic enterprise. Last week, Dr. Stewart presented and gave a superb presentation on an issue that really blends nicely with what we will have being discussed here today by an august set of panelists. These panelists include Dr. Emily Brearley, Dr. Kirk Douglas, Dr. Robert Stewart, Dr. Priya Mohan, and Dr. Don Charles. And we are really proud, notwithstanding the international nature of our panel, and all of our panels have really had international appeal, whether by virtue of the panelists or the audience. I am really pleased with what we have been able to assemble here today. And in particular, I want to thank Dr. Stewart for pulling all of this together along with the staff of SALISES. So again, thank you to Dr. Stewart, and thank you to all of the panelists who graciously agreed to come to the fore and ensure that SALISES does have yet another worthwhile encounter that will engage and stimulate discussion and add to the store of knowledge which SALISES aims to satisfy in so many ways. Many of you can go to our website and you will see coverage of all of the forums and all of the spotlight lectures and the conferences that we have been hosting in recent times. So again, I want to thank all who have joined this event today. I want in particular to express my sincerest thanks to the panelists for agreeing to participate. And we look forward, and I expect that, you know, today's proceedings will be no different from those we have become accustomed to, and it will really be a fantastic treat, scholarly treat, in terms of how, you know, a group of scholars, a group of academics, a group of practitioners can bring their thoughts together and stimulate discussion with the sole purpose of advancing progressive ideals as they relate to, you know, development issues and the general theme of today's forum, which is development finance for a low carbon Caribbean future, issues and solutions. So thank you very much, and I hope everyone enjoys today's proceedings. Thanks a million.
Thank you, Dr. St. Bernard. So as Dr. Bernard mentioned, we have 5 panel members today that will each engage a critical issue on this forum topic. Our first panel member will be Dr. Elizabeth Bearley, who has quite an extensive resume. So to be brief, she is a development economist with several decades of experience at multilateral development financial institutions, including the IDB and the World Bank. She has worked across Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and the Middle East and North Africa, with a focus on public-private partnerships and innovation to solve critical global development challenges. Today, Dr. Burley will discuss carbon pricing through a moral lens and how this has manifested in practical terms. Our second presenter will be Dr. Kirk Douglas, who also has quite an extensive resume. In brief, he is the director of the Center for Biosecurity Studies at the Cato campus of the University of the West Indies, and he is a professional senior scientist recognized both regionally and internationally for his work in the areas of virology, biosecurity, infectious disease, climate change, among other areas. He has a PhD in medical microbiology and also holds an MBA. Dr. Douglas will be discussing the influence of climate change on wildfires in Barbados and the development of an early warning system for prediction. Our third presenter will be Dr. Don Charles, and Dr. Charles is an economist and an economic consultant with over 20 years of experience covering economic research, project management, procurement, and industrial relations. And his presentation will look at loss and damage financing for natural disaster recovery. Dr. Priya Mohan will be our fourth presenter. Dr. Mohan is a senior fellow here at SALISES St. Augustine, and her research is focused on Caribbean growth and development, including topics such as natural disasters and climate policy, public finance, entrepreneurship, innovation, and knowledge economies. Her presentation will discuss the financing of nationally determined contributions. And I'll be the final presenter, and in my presentation, I will explore common tools used to increase private financing towards low carbon development. Each presentation will be about 10 minutes, and at the end of the 5 presentations, we will have an open Q&A with the panel. So I will now turn over to Dr. Burley as the first presenter. Dr. Burley.
Thank you so much. I'm incredibly honored to be here. I was supposed to be at home in my cold apartment in Washington, D.C., but I'm actually talking to you from Ethiopia, from Addis Ababa, for a work trip. So it might get noisy and the lights might turn out, but hey, we'll just do our best. I'm actually a really big fan nowadays of people who get to the bottom line up front. And so I wanted to start by giving you my personal opinion of the role of carbon financing and carbon pricing in our challenge, our climate change challenge. And that is that I think the role is limited. This is quite a controversial opinion. And it's that carbon pricing doesn't really address the development challenges that we would want, and it doesn't really work. Until recently, after 20 years at the World Bank and the IDB, that would have been your lot. I wouldn't have had a corollary. I wouldn't have had anything positive. I would have been very grumpy. I very much resembled the girl from the movie called Don't Look Up, played by Jennifer Lawrence, who is just terrified about everything and screaming, we're all going to die. During COVID, I had a time to relax a little bit and recoup. And now I do have a corollary to the dire warning that carbon pricing doesn't work. And that's that it does have its place, but we also have to look at alternate, more effective routes, especially in the Caribbean. But let's just look at why carbon pricing ostensibly looks so cool and sexy and why people still talk about it and will continue to talk about it. In theory, carbon pricing looks wonderful. And economists love it because it's essentially a price signal. It's an elegant response to a complex problem, and it will cut greenhouse gas emissions by placing a fee on those emissions. So economists like it, but also human beings like it because it seems to have this moral component that those responsible for climate change will pay for it, and that incentives will build up and we will emit less. So it will shift consumption and investment patterns. And indeed, we've seen in the Paris Agreement in 2015 that the rich countries, in theory, said, yes, we agree, we caused this problem, and we will contribute to financing and carbon pricing through taxes. Of course, for V20 countries, many of Many of these countries are in the Caribbean: Barbados, Grenada, Guyana, St. Lucia, Trinidad and Tobago. They are all part of the vulnerable to climate change group. They like carbon pricing. And right now, according to the UNFCCC, about a quarter of global emissions are under some kind of carbon pricing mechanism. So it all sounds really nice, really rosy. But what is the problem? The problem is that it does not work. Since 2013, the annual supply of pollution permits has been consistently higher than overall pollution. And that means that the price to pollute is being set too low. There's also been a coordinated opposition by powerful fossil fuel companies and fossil fuel aligned groups. And while some people like the elegance of this in theory, in practice, it's been incredibly politically unpopular in rich countries. In Australia, a carbon tax, for example, was introduced in 2011. There were angry protests. In France, the Gilets jaunes were protests essentially against a French carbon tax. Even in California, lefty liberal California, the carbon tax was very much watered down. And for me, the problem is that talking about carbon pricing somewhat obscures the other routes that we could take. It conceals the long run benefits to the environment, to public health, to the economy of investing in climate smart solutions. So now that I'm a happier human being and have time to get over my moral burnout, which I'm sure all of my colleagues feel that at times, talking about these challenges in climate, what is my corollary to this dire picture? Really, for me, regulation is key. It's not cool, it's not sexy, but it's absolutely necessary. We need regulation on emissions, clean energy, cars, energy efficiency. But we also have to look to adaptation. And then in the Caribbean, I think that's accepting that we're going to live in a world where 1.5 degrees C is a reality, at least for several decades. And that's going to mean boring, diligent planning, disaster risk management, as I know one of my colleagues is going to talk about. And indeed, the World Bank has estimated that on average, every dollar spent on adaptation brings $4 in benefits. Later on, we can talk about the case of Guyana. I worked for many years on Guyana. They just got REDD+ credits, which is kind of a form of carbon pricing, but why that also doesn't fix the problems, the very real problems of Georgetown increasingly facing flooding and really looking after their rainforests, and of course the new oil exploitation and a possible sovereign wealth fund. So that's a whole can of worms. It's hard to sum all this up in 10 minutes, but hopefully I've given you some food for thought. And again, can't wait to get into the discussion. Many thanks.
Dr. Burley, and certainly there'll be quite a few questions to address some of the statements you just made, the Q&A. Now we'll just move over to Dr. Kirk Douglas for his presentation. Dr. Douglas, please.
Good morning to everyone, and thank you very much, Dr. Stewart. Let me just share my screen. And this morning, I want to speak on, in terms of the economic costs of climate change, but from a sustainability perspective. I think it was Sir Richard Branson who was quoted as saying climate change is a huge challenge, and we all know this, but it can be brought in line if governments, businesses, and individuals work together. And I think that if you get anything from this presentation is that particular point. This has to be a collective effort if we are to achieve what we want to. This is the Center for Biosecurity Studies, of which I'm the director. And these are our focal areas: biosecurity and trade and climate change and its impacts. These will be pertinent to this particular presentation. And just to give you a very brief context of biosecurity, where we view it is the science and practice of safeguarding lives and livelihoods. This is done through the reduction of systematic vulnerabilities to biological ecosystems. Sounds like a big set of words. All it means is that you're trying to preserve lives and also livelihoods. And this is all within the context of ecosystems, which can be as small as your home. You have windows and doors to your home. These serve to protect you not only from criminals, but also from the elements, wind, rain, snow if you live further north, and also from pests and pathogens as well. So, like the ways for a country, you have windows and doors, and these are the ports of entry. This would be the airport and the seaport. And during COVID-19, we all know how they operated, that the entry of persons was regulated with certain policies. So it's just that method of analysis. I would love this particular framework to analyze biosecurity issues. It's called XTEAL, and what it does, it incorporates several different lenses through which you can view a biosecurity issue. Let me change it one biosecurity issue because it has cascading ramifications that include health, that include climate, that include the environment as well. And the STEAL, as you can see, is political, economic, social, technical, health, environment, ethics, and the legal component. When we speak of climate change, this is one of the risk factors as it relates to biosecurity, but there are two other major ones in terms of human and infrastructure. These all converge when we have climate change situation. You have the wet form of climate change, with flooding, storms, cyclones, also the dry side with droughts, wildfires, etc. And these all play a very integral role in terms of how they can impact on lives and livelihoods. And within the Caribbean, there's a certain crisis that we're facing. So we have sargassum and seaweed, as you can see here. In Barbados, we have issues with natural gas. Gasoline prices are among the highest in the world. For Barbados and throughout the Caribbean, as the price of oil continues to fluctuate. We have a food security and domestic food production issue. We import a lot of our food. So this is the current scenario, and we have to look at this context and then frame it in terms of what we can do with climate financing if we are to achieve it. And there are also some vulnerabilities which we may or may not be aware of. And these two main ones are tourism and trade. Tourism and trade are the bedrock of our economies within the Caribbean, in most Caribbean countries, but they're also major vulnerabilities. One of the important things is that within the socio-economic development within the Caribbean, there has been an emphasis on trade and tourism. So we finance these and given them economic support. However, we haven't given the requisite support as it relates to waste management and also healthcare. And this has led to a skewed development focus. And this has created also a blind spot. One of the blind spots is that we generate copious volumes of waste due to this economic activity in terms of tourism and also in terms of trade, because of all the products that we import. We use them, we utilize them, but then we have to throw them away. The same thing with tourism. Tourism generate 3 times the amount of waste that a resident would. And then you look at the numbers of tourists that transit through a country. In Barbados, I think from 2000 to present, the average number of tourists from Barbados was over 1 million tourists. And we multiply that by 3, that's 3 million in terms of the quantity of waste compared to our population, which is about 370,000. So you can see that there's a great disparity. And if you continue to expand tourism, expand trade as you want to do, and you do that, in tandem, expand your waste management systems, you will always create a better situation as it relates to air pollution, as it relates to water pollution, land pollution, and all the other health impacts that come along with it. So this is a place that we have to be very careful. We have to rectify, we have to move the economic policies with tourism and trade, with waste management and health. And I also see, for instance, a similar situation forming. It's not yet there, and I hope that we can hopefully identify it and rectify it. But in terms of the carbon approach and carbon mitigation, as it relates to emissions, wind solar, utilizing wind and electric vehicles. These are all nice and these are all well and good. However, there is a skewness again, less is being said about their energy and also geothermal energy for those government countries who can actually utilize it, like in the US and some of the other countries that have volcanic activity that they can utilize it. And what is the particular blind spot? One of the blind spots is that these are singular solutions to the energy crisis. And so they don't have any other impact in terms of the solutions, whereas biogas, for instance, has cascading impacts in terms of solutions to several problems. And remember, I said the context of the Caribbean is that we have an energy crisis. We have several different crises occurring and converging together. So when we plan, when we strategize, we have to bear this in mind and make the correct decision as it relates to the expenditure of this financing. The other issue is that you can also create a future risk problem because all of these electric vehicles, all of these solar energy systems usually have storage capacity, and this storage capacity comes in the form of batteries. And these batteries contain lithium, they also contain lead, and these are emitters that can potentially pollute your environment if your waste management systems are not adequately outfitted to process them and to process this waste. And this is a problem that is growing that we have to take into consideration. The other issue is that in terms of the socioeconomic inequality, you potentially could also create a waiting gap because not everyone will be able to electrify. And the problem with persons who have gasoline vehicles, who have purpose electric vehicles, what are they going to do? And so you have to find a bridge in terms of your mitigation strategies and adaptation strategies for emissions. And within Barbados, I know our energy policy for 2030 is that we want to be carbon neutral by that date, which is very ambitious and very aggressive, and what I actually support as well. And I'm saying that this can also be an area where we can create alternatives, where we can create bridges for people who have gasoline vehicles that are not at the stage where they can actually purchase an electric vehicle. And within the context of climate change and there's a number of different waste streams that we have. And from 1 to 6, these are ones that I have identified and we can actually, and this is in terms of framed solutions now, that we can actually utilize and leverage in circular economy to drive new economic activity. And this is the schematic of it. And to the left, you can see numbers 1 through 5. And these are the economic products that can be generated in anaerobic co-digestion of waste, taken in particular sewage in this water. That is a major problem in the Caribbean for decades. What we've been doing is treating the sewage, diluting it, and then putting it out to sea, and harming our marine ecosystem, our coral reefs, which also serve as a natural barrier in terms of reducing the amount of action from storms and from hurricanes. And so we are really shooting ourselves in the foot by doing this. And I think a number of governments have recognized it, but we also advocated in terms of a solution, not only to identify the problem, but we can actually utilize this in streams. So gas and seaweed as well. This is a new stream that's come to the ensure trade of many areas across the Caribbean because it impacts on tourism and growing economic sources of revenue. And so we can actually leverage that stream and convert it into these products from digested. This digested is an excellent organic fertilizer because it removes the microbial activity in soils on which several Caribbean countries have very infertile soils. And then in terms of the beauty of it, water lasts for cooking, transportation, also electricity generation. But then you have the reclamation of water. And for Barbados, we are amongst the 15 most water scarce countries in the entire world. So we have to think in different ways of retaining our water and utilizing it in different ways. And this can be utilized for agriculture, but also for extinguishing wildfires, because in Barbados, we actually utilize potable water the extinction of forests, and then carbon dioxide, because this is something featured in the climate change conversation. I think is given a bad rep in terms of it being only deleterious and odorless, but it can actually be leveraged to become a very lucrative commodity from the most medical arenas and medical gas, food and beverage for beverages, also for clean ingredients fractions for pharmaceuticals, nutraceuticals, even fragrances and flavors. You can utilize liquid carbon monoxide to build extracts from the diversity and not a lot of potential as well. And we're hoping through the WI that we can drive that innovation and drive that entrepreneurship and research so that we can unlock the value in our bioeconomy within carbon and also for oil extraction. And this is climate change conversation. We can also utilize carbon monoxide in the oil and gas industry as well. And then in construction. And this is probably one of the best kept secrets in terms of the climate change conversation. You can actually trap carbon dioxide that you generate into your infrastructure. So imagine your homes, your hotels, your roads, your concrete. Instead of using water, you can actually utilize carbon dioxide with your cement to actually build your nation. And this, I think, is an excellent strategy that we should explore and see how best we can do that. And the beauty of it is all self-sustaining because lots will continue to be generated. We have people, we have tourism, we have trade. And so this, I think, going forward is what should be part of that energy mix and also part of the innovative economic strategy as we look to climate change that can be financing. And these are different multifaceted areas where our energy has impact in terms of the environment, healthy programs, clean air as well. Obviously, waste management, energy, food security, public health, because you have less vermin and mosquitoes as we go with dengue, chikungunya, and Zika here in the Caribbean. And also in terms of tourism, you have a cleaner island, you have less mosquito bites and less infectious diseases, more attractive to people to come here and actually see that in the face of climate change, what the Caribbean is inviting and actually and also the generation of jobs, green jobs, bioeconomy jobs, construction, and all the other outputs from this particular activity. And so we are quite happy to also even speak to the economic policies that go along with it, because for a long time, this has been viewed as onerous. It has been punitive in terms of people being punished, the community pays. But we want to flip that paradigm and tell people that this is actually a commodity. And so on your balance sheet, it's not a liability, but it's actually an asset. And so therefore, you can actually be paid and remunerated for your risk. I would think that this strategy will be self-reinforcing and help people to actually join in the fight of really taking care of your risk because it's economically beneficial to you. And so you are incentivized to do the right thing. And we think that if we do this, we can have a cascading effect in the private sector, in the government as well, and also within our communities, because everyone will be doing something that is going to be paying them for all of the right reasons. And so therefore, in terms of the credits that can come, and I know about this, so we rules relate to water and our water meters, and we can do something similar. So on ways that you contribute, especially if you have a national system, then you get either green credits or you get a cash rebate. And so we incentivize people every month on a monthly basis and on the end of the year, because that's a little too long for people to see the watch or the hard work. And if you do it on a monthly basis, this can actually to reduce in cost of living for persons who desperately need some assistance. I think that we go forward in this manner, then we will be moving closer to the ideal goal. So in summary, we want to tailor our city's economic and development profiles to the problem that we have. We have to be multifaceted in terms of the impact and also reducing foreign inputs. And we just have to have more impact for every dollar that we have. And again, I leave you with change is constant. So whatever systems you build, we have to deal with this mechanism as it relates to climate change, as it relates to change, and so that we can have a safer environment. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We'll turn to Dr. Charles for his presentation now. Dr. Charles. Sorry, Dr. Charles, you muted.
Hello, good day, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to thank Dr. St. Bernard and Dr. Stewart for the warm introduction and the invitation to present at today's seminar. I'd like to thank the two previous presenters, Dr. Douglas and Dr. Bialy, for their warm and very informative presentations. So let me share my screen. Share screen. So as you can see from the title of my presentation, it's disaster insurance to address damage and loss from climate change in the Caribbean. So as you can guess from the title of my presentation, it's about climate change. So climate change, what is climate change? Climate change is a change in the statistical distribution of weather patterns. So for some countries in the world, climate change will manifest in the form of change and the increase in the frequency and intensity of extreme weather events such as hurricanes, tropical cyclones, storms, and tornadoes. For some countries in the world, climate change will manifest by the greater occurrence of slow onset events such as sea level rise and ocean acidification. Now, the evidence is already there to suggest that the Caribbean is being disproportionately affected by climate change. Take, for instance, look at the 2021 Atlantic hurricane season. It was the sixth consecutive season, so that's the 2016 to 2021 period, that was above average. If you look at the hurricane season from 2015 to 2019, it featured every hurricane season over that period featured at least one Category 5 hurricane. Now, when these extreme weather events occur, it usually results in a cost for the Caribbean governments. So if you look at 2020, Hurricane Isaac caused approximately $225 million in damages to the Caribbean. If you look at Hurricane Elsa in 2021, it caused approximately US $50 million in damage to the Caribbean. Now, when these extreme weather events cause this massive damage, usually it's the governments that are charged with the responsibility of restoring all the damaged infrastructure. This is a cost, and usually the governments don't have sufficient public finance to finance this out of pocket. So usually they resort to borrowing, which results in an increase in debt. Now, this is a problem in the sense that we have the Caribbean region being disproportionately being affected by climate change, but the Caribbean countries are not responsible for climate change. If you look at the Caribbean countries, all the Caribbean countries are low absolute emitters of greenhouse gases. In contrast, the industrialized countries, while in climate change negotiations, they are recognized as the Annex 1 countries, they are the primary culprits of the climate change in the sense that they are the major emitters of greenhouse gases. Now, if you look at the climate science, the geography, the climatology, the meteorology, the climate science cannot link any country's greenhouse gas emission to any specific extreme weather event occurring in any country. But we have a problem. The climate science can't link the weather events, to any specific country, yet we know collectively that the greenhouse gas emissions of countries is responsible for the problem. So there's an urgent need to mobilize financing to address the problem. So what I was proposing as a financial mechanism to address the problem was insurance. I was proposing a climate insurance, a parametric climate insurance to mobilize finance to address damage and loss from climate change in the Caribbean. And when I say damage and loss, I look at damage and loss, looking at the effects, the impacts of climate change that goes beyond that adaptation and goes beyond mitigation. Now, if you go look back previously in the year 2009, in the 15 confronting parties, there was this conference recognized the whole issue of loss and damage from climate change, and countries pledged to actually to mobilize 100 billion per year in climate finance from 2020 onwards. Now, this is the year 2022. 2020 has passed 2 years ago, and this pledge has not materialized. So there's an urgent need to mobilize finance to address damage and loss from climate change. And this brings me to the context of my whole presentation. I was proposing the insurance mechanism as the ideal mechanism to mobilize the appropriate finance to address damage and loss from climate change. Now, insurance. What is insurance? Insurance is a framework that allows one party, called the policyholder, to transfer the risk of a potential loss from an event to another party called the insurer. Now, the policyholder pays the insurer a fee. This fee is called a premium to bear this risk. Now, if the unfortunate event occurs, the policyholder could file a claim and receive a sum of money called a payout from the insurer. So thus, the insurance is a framework that can be used to mobilize payment and can use to offset the potential risks from potential losses. Now, the insurance was proposed, it was an ideal mechanism to address damage and loss of climate change, and it has to be organized along the principle of solidarity. Solidarity is where policyholders and an insurance mechanism enter a pool for sharing losses. Now, each policyholder would have a risk. The risk in this context would be probability or likelihood of the extreme weather event occurring. So each policyholder will have a risk, but they'll be required to pay a premium that is not proportional to the risk that they bear. Why? Because we want to have low-risk countries and high-risk countries in the pool. You want to have a sufficiently large pool of countries, and you want to be able to share the risk among, or share or spread the risk among all countries in the pool. And once it's structured like that, what we'll have is effective cross-subsidization, in the sense that we'll have the low-risk countries, but high-emitting countries will be effectively cross-subsidizing the risk of the low-emitting countries, but high-risk countries. Moving on. So there are multiple levels of insurance. Now, it might seem like I'm skipping through the presentation, but I'm trying to be concise within the 10 minutes period of time. So in multiple levels of insurance, there's macro insurance, there's meso insurance, and there's micro insurance. If you look at the macro insurance, the policyholder is the government, typically the government. So they pay the premium to the insurer to gain coverage from a natural disaster or extreme weather event. If you look at the meso insurance, the policyholder is a special interest group. And if you look at microinsurance, the policyholder tends to be individuals. Now, insurance can be parametric or insurance can be indemnity-based. When you look at parametric insurance allows the policyholder to file claims only after the occurrence of the extreme weather event in the context of here, or in named peril. Well, in named peril, well, the insurance framework or the insurance policy will actually state what is the peril or the event that will trigger the payments. Now, in the context of this climate insurance, the named peril could be excess rainfall or could be excess wind. So once the named peril occurs, it will trigger the payout, and the policyholder will be able to receive this payout from the insurer. This is advantageous because it's relatively simple, easy to administer, and you can know in advance what sum of money the policyholder will receive once the name occurs. Now, the other type of insurance called indemnity insurance. This is where the policyholder files claims in response to losses that they incur. This could work, but in the context of extreme weather events, usually a large number of stakeholders tend to be affected at the same period of time. So it becomes relatively difficult for like on-site assessors to assess the losses and verify if the actual policyholders' claims are true. and so forth. So it tends to result in the indemnity insurance tend to be relatively slow and efficient because it's very difficult to assess all the different claims of the different policyholders at the same period in time. Now, we have several examples of the different types of insurance in the Caribbean. Take, for instance, we have an insurance called the Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility. This is a parametric insurance, and it is a parametric insurance, and it is also a macro insurance. The policyholders are governments. So we have 23 members, that's 19 Caribbean countries. And when the extreme weather event occurs, it results in a, well, the name peril occurs, it results in a payout to the different governments. Of course, the sums for the payout are agreed beforehand. And it actually works because, take for instance, we have Trinidad and Tobago. There was some excess rainfall this year, 2022. And we know for a fact that the governor of Trinidad and Tobago recently received a payout from the CCRIF. So it works and usually mobilize payout. And this money is usually enough to cover the cost of relief and recovery. However, the money is generally not enough to cover the cost of loss and damage. So what I'm proposing is something different from the CCRIF in the context that I'm proposing a larger payout that can be issued to governments, whereas this CCRIF is mobilized as a smaller payout, which is just sufficient to cover relief and recovery efforts. The other insurance we have in the Caribbean region is called WindCrop. That's the Windward Islands Crop Insurance Limited. This targets a special interest groups, that's the banana farmers in the Eastern Caribbean. It works to some extent in the sense that it allows, when there's excess wind or there's excess rainfall, it allows banana farmers to be compensated. The problem with this, it's relatively difficult to administer because when the extreme weather event occurs, like a hurricane, we tend to see a large number of policyholders being affected at the same point in time, and it becomes very difficult for the on-site assessors to assess the losses and assess the claims. So it results in this indemnity insurance being slow, inefficient, and it takes a while for the policyholders to receive their claims, so to receive their payout. So there's room for improvement, and so we realize that the indemnity insurance is not really the best model. The third type of insurance we have in the Caribbean is called micro. This was developed in 2011 in response to the devastating earthquake that occurred in Haiti. In the year 2015, micro was expanded to allow for 3 perils. That was drought, excess rainfall, and earthquakes. And in 2016, it was expanded to include Guatemala. So no longer just targets only individuals in Haiti, it also targets the individuals in Guatemala. So the proposed insurance, what I was recommending, should be structured as follows. So one, it should be administered at the UNFCCC level. Why? Because you want to have insurance that is structured and it will be contain policyholders from both the high-risk countries, the high-risk instance of they have a high probability or high likelihood of experiencing an extreme weather event, as well as low-risk countries, which have a low probability of experiencing the extreme weather event. Not only that, is that we want to have the countries that are both high emitters of greenhouse gases and the low emitters of greenhouse gases, both in the insurance pool. The insurance needs to be structured along the principle of solidarity because you want to be policyholders to be paying a premium that is not proportional to the risk, and they want to spread the risk among all the policyholders in the pool. And when it's structured like that, eventually what will be implemented, well, it essentially be implementing the polluters pay principle, because you'll be getting the high emitting countries, which are also low risk countries, to be cross-subsidizing the cost of loss and damage for the high-risk countries, which are also the low emitting countries. And this is excellent because it allows for the mobilization of finance, but at the same point in time, no country is held legally liable for climate change or any extreme weather event occurring in any country. The insurance should be parametric in the sense that it should have an index, or there should be some named peril, and it should be trigger the release of payouts to the policyholders after the named perils occurs. The insurance should be a macro level, as the policyholders should be governments. And in conclusion, I want to say that this insurance is highly advantageous, as it can mobilize damage and loss such as climate change without attributing any legal liability to any country. Now, I just want to add additional point. I know recently there was a conference of the parties this year, I think it was last month, and there was a new fund as an outcome of the conference. The parties agreed to establish a new fund to address damage and loss from climate change. So this will mobilize some level of finance. However, the text of the fund has not been operationalized. They haven't articulated how the fund will be operationalized and how much finance it will mobilize and so forth. Then the parties agree that this will be discussed in the next conference of the parties. So what I'm saying here in terms of this proposed damage and loss insurance, it will more or less complement the proposed fund that will be developed at the next conference and parties, in the sense that you can have a fund that will mobilize grant funding to address damage and loss from climate change. And at the same point in time, you can also have an insurance mechanism that can also mobilize financing. And this insurance mechanism can be targeted specifically for the Caribbean potential policyholders, as it can mobilize additional financing that goes beyond adaptation and goes beyond mitigation to address the different effects and impacts on climate change. So this brings me to the end of my presentation.
Thank you very much, Dr. Charles.
Yeah.
Go on to Priya Mohan now, please, Priya.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, good morning, everyone. I would like to thank SALISES for the invitation to present today at what is now our 14th virtual forum, Development Finance for a Low Carbon Caribbean Future, Issues and Solutions. My presentation is entitled Financing National Determined Contributions, or as we refer to them more commonly as the NDCs, in Caribbean Small Island Developing States, or SIDS. Before we get into the actual issue of the NDCs, I would like to speak a little bit about the Paris Agreement. While we may all be familiar with the term, I would just like to point out 3 specific issues involved in the Paris Agreement. Now, this agreement is a legally binding agreement on climate change adopted by 196 parties at the United Nations Climate Change Conference, or the UNCCC 21st Conference of the Parties, COP21 in Paris in 2015. Now, what was so historic about this agreement is that it was the first binding agreement to bring all countries together in the fight against climate change and to adapt to its effects. And this brings us to the 3 main points I would like to highlight out of the agreement. Firstly, the agreement takes into account mitigation. So the aim of the agreement is to limit our average global temperature increase to less than 2 degrees Celsius, preferably 1.5 degrees Celsius, to achieve our net zero emissions by mid-century. So this involves actions to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. Secondly, the agreement talks about climate change adaptation. So we want to enhance resilience and adaptation to climate change. This means issues such as natural disaster insurance, as we've heard in some of the previous presentations, issues to mitigate against flooding, issues in health, etc., as we adapt to the changes of climate change. And the third important aspect of the Paris Agreement is, of course, finance. How are we going to finance our mitigation and adaptation actions? And there is provision in the agreement that finance is expected to flow from developed countries, which are supposed to be the main polluters, to developing countries, including islands in the Caribbean. So in the Paris Agreement, countries agree to communicate their climate actions, and this is what we call the NDCs. countries communicate the actions that they intend to take to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, and also the actions they intend to take to adapt to climate change. Now, these NDCs are based, of course, on the particular characteristics of the countries, so the level of vulnerability in the countries, the capacity of the countries to adapt and mitigate against climate change, and of course, their vulnerabilities to the impacts of climate change. Given this characteristic of the NDCs, they are viewed as a key component in securing the adoption of the Paris Agreement. And in 2020, 192 countries, along with the EU, submitted their NDCs to the UNFCCC. They have also agreed that the NDCs would be updated in 5-year cycles to become more ambitious over time. And in the Caribbean, as well as countries throughout the world, most countries, all countries would have submitted, almost all would have submitted their initial NDCs, and most Caribbean countries would have now submitted an updated NDC. What is the role of SIDS in all of this? Well, as would have been communicated in the previous presentation, SIDS contribute actually less than 1% of global greenhouse gas emissions. However, their geographic, socioeconomic, and climate profiles actually make them most vulnerable, or at least highly vulnerable, to climate change impacts, whether we are talking increased frequency and intensity of natural disasters, heavier rainfall, longer periods of drought, sea level rise, coastal erosion, etc. Now, SIDS have played a pivotal role in raising awareness on climate change in the international stage and advocating for climate action. They were very important in COP21 in that negotiating period in bringing about the Paris Agreement. They were also among the first countries globally to submit their NDCs. And we've seen in the last COP27, SIDS, Caribbean SIDS in particular, playing a huge role in the issue of the loss and damage fund that Dr. Charles would have referred to earlier. And so this lobbying by SIDS would have allowed them to secure their special circumstance as vulnerable countries in the Paris Agreement. And so the agreement does list SIDS as especially vulnerable to climate change and calls for their efficient access to finance, technology, and capacity building. But is this really happening? So let's speak a bit about climate finance. We do have these adaptation and mitigation actions, but how are we going to actually finance them? And so inadequate access to finance has been the major challenge in achieving the Paris Agreement. So the agreement does provide a framework for finance in that it calls for financial assistance from parties with more financial resources compared to those with less and those that are more vulnerable. But we've seen, as pointed out in the earlier presentations, that the pledges committed have not been fulfilled thus far. The 100 billion, we are still very much far away from that figure. Of course, SIDS face a particularly vulnerable financing position in that they have a restricted capacity to cope with the consequences of climate change, but yet their access to international climate finance has been limited. In fact, they have only received 2.2% of global climate funds over the past 5 years or so. And so they face various challenges in accessing climate finance. These challenges include reliance on a single provider. So most times it would generally be through a bilateral agreement. Perhaps Germany or the UK or Canada would be the major financier of climate projects in SIDS. There's also, once this finance is received, the finance becomes fragmented over a whole range of projects, and this can, of course, lead to inefficiencies. Also, there's limited public budget support. So the public finance in these countries are very limited to actually support climate change projects. Also, there are complex requirements and processes. What I mean by this is that in applying for these international climate grants, you have to go through rigorous requirements before you can actually access these grants. And SIDS do not necessarily have the capability to maneuver through these issues to actually access the financing. Similarly, the institutional policies support required to access these financing is very limited in SIDS, and of course, human resources. Most times the technical capacity of the human resources in these countries are unable to put together the proposals required to access international climate finance. So I want to speak specifically now on Caribbean SIDS. So SIDS in general do face finance challenges, as I've pointed out, in financing their climate action. But Caribbean SIDS are of a special case, I would like to call them. They're a special case in that they face even more severe challenges, in my view, in accessing international finance for climate change and for disaster mitigation, preparedness, etc. The majority of Caribbean states are classified as upper or high middle income countries by the World Bank classification. Now, given that a large share of climate finance comes from the traditional bilateral aid challenges, this means that the Caribbean receives relatively less access to international climate finance, let's say compared to SIDS in the Pacific. Also, because of this high income status, the majority of our Caribbean SIDS are not eligible for concessional financing. So this is despite the region being highly vulnerable to climate change and natural disasters, with the region being pointed out as being amongst the most disaster-prone territories in the world, along with high growth and low debt and limited domestic resources. You would often find that following a natural disaster in the Caribbean, we do not necessarily benefit from international aid or international debt relief. But thankfully, we do have the insurance scheme, as Dr. Charles pointed out earlier. So there is financing coming through certain mechanisms, but international aid may not necessarily come to the region following these disaster impacts, again, because of this high income status. And SIDS in the Caribbean have been lobbying and advocating at various COPs that this classification away from income be changed to one based on vulnerability, so that countries in the region can be judged based on their vulnerability in accessing climate finance rather than their income status based on some GDP figure. So this brings us to my question, how are Caribbean states actually going to finance their climate goals given these challenges that they face? And what I'm going to present briefly for you, because the presentation is just 10 minutes long, is just a summary of findings from a paper published in Climate Policy, where I looked at the NDCs in the Caribbean. And just briefly, the findings of the study show that in studying the NDCs of the Caribbean, these countries have really established very, very ambitious climate mitigation and adaptation action. They have outlined very ambitious action in their NDCs. These mitigation targets include policies and actions related to renewable energy. They also include actions related to reducing relative and absolute greenhouse gas emissions, so relative to some previous period or just an absolute number. And I'll give you some examples of this. So in Antigua and Barbuda, they have stated in their NDCs that they intend that 86%, they intend to have 86% renewable electricity. And they also intend to have 100% electric vehicles by 2030. In Barbados, there's the intention to have 100% greenhouse gas reduction. In Belize, there's the intention to have 85% renewables within their energy framework. In Guyana, they intend to have 100% renewables within their energy frameworks. And in Suriname, there's the intention to have 35% renewable electricity, as well as 93% forest cover. So these targets sound great for combating climate change, and they are very ambitious. The targets are generally economy-wide, so they We intend to reduce greenhouse gas emissions across the economy, but we've also identified specific sectors in which we see we need to reduce emissions. And these are primarily in energy, of course, agriculture, transport, waste, land use change, and forestry, and industry. And these mitigation targets are primarily conditional, meaning that these targets will be implemented on the condition of receiving the financing to carry them out. So these would just remain targets if we do not have the financing to implement them, because they are conditional. Now, in the NDCs, there are some unconditional targets, and unconditional meaning that the countries would implement these targets whether they receive international climate finance or not. But the Caribbean countries make it very clear that the unconditional targets are generally of a non-monetary nature. So they would involve issues like providing the policy environment and institutional support in order for climate actions to be carried out, or the human resources involved. It does not necessarily mean that the region is going to pledge cash to carry out these climate mitigation actions. And this is generally because they just do not have the kind of financing required to do so. Now, if we look at the adaptation targets in the NDCs, again, they are very ambitious, and the majority of countries in the region do include adaptation actions, and they span a whole range of sectors from water and food security, climate smart agriculture, climate-proof tourism, the health sector, coastal zone management, infrastructure development, disaster risk management, sustainable construction, natural disaster insurance schemes, and inclusion of the vulnerable population, women, youth, indigenous persons, persons with disabilities, etc. And in the NDCs from Caribbean countries, they have clearly stated that these adaptation targets are conditional. So these adaptation targets are only possible if the region receives the necessary financing to carry them out. So what the study also does, it seeks to estimate the financing needs of the region in implementing these mitigation and adaptation actions. So based on a review of the NDCs for the Caribbean, countries would have provided estimates of various climate projects that they intend to carry out between 2015 to 2030 to cost these NDCs. And what we see is that the grand figure for the region, it's $51 billion US dollars needed between 2015 to 2030 to implement these climate adaptation and mitigation projects. Now, this 51 billion is also a gross underestimation, because you would see some dashes in there. This is because some countries have actually not costed their climate adaptation and mitigation actions yet. They have yet to do so. So this is very much an underestimation. Also, countries that would have costed their adaptation and mitigation actions, there are certain projects that still needs to be costed. So this 51 billion is just a ballpark figure, which can be much more and is required by 2030 if these climate adaptation mitigation actions are to be carried out in the region. Also, we see that the adaptation and mitigation actions for the majority of the countries, they are fully conditional on receiving that international support. In countries such as Antigua, Belize, Dominica, if that international support is not received, these actions cannot be carried out. So I just want to start wrapping up and go to some main findings of the study and how we go forward. So in studying the NDCs of the Caribbean, we see that there is a significant climate finance gap, in that this huge figure is required, 51 billion, over the period 2015 to 2030 to carry out these ambitious mitigation and adaptation actions. If we look at a historical record of climate finance received by the region from 2010 to 2015, just 3% of that 51 billion would have actually been received so far to fight climate change mitigation and to carry out climate change mitigation and adaptation action. So we see that there is a huge financing gap in the region if we want to really tackle climate change. Another key takeaway from the paper is that we cannot remain dependent on international climate finance if we are serious about pursuing climate action in the region. As I said, just about 3% of that total figure would have been received by historical trends. What does this mean? We, as a region, we need to pursue some more innovative and diversified options if we are to achieve our climate goals. And previous speakers would have spoken to the issue of insurance and carbon taxes, carbon pricing as options going forward. Also, we do face challenges in aligning our domestic fiscal policies and other economic and regulatory incentives and private sector investments to actually complement and boost international climate finance. So if we can align our own public finance and private finance with international climate finance, then we can punch much higher when it comes to climate action in the region. So how do we go forward? How do we create that space to finance climate action in the region? Well, most of the countries in the region are doing it in their own small ways, but this action needs to be significantly ramped up. So one way this can be done, countries can actually mainstream NDCs into their existing development plans. So countries typically have development goals, development plans. What we've been seeing now is that we've been moving to a place where we can actually introduce climate action into our national development plans. Guyana has done so in its low carbon development strategy, and Dominica has also done so in its low carbon climate resilient development strategy. What this means is that once climate action comes into the country's development plans, then the public budget becomes available for climate action. Also, we can improve our budgetary tracking and performance monitoring. We can look at our climate expenditure. We can look at climate expenditure review and budget coding. And by improving our budgetary performance tracking, this can actually attract donors to provide more climate finance for us. So if we seem to be a very prudent partner, then we will be able to attract greater climate finance. We can also leverage compatible private sector investments. And of course, we always hear public-private partnerships. And this has been working very well in Barbados in the solar energy sector, where we have a lot of private firms participating in that sector, becoming very lucrative and profitable for a private firm to actually be involved in solar energy in Barbados. We can also talk fiscal policy reform, which the first speaker alluded to, environmental taxes, green incentives, and of course, removal of subsidies. This is, of course, a very, very contentious issue, given that we are facing record high levels of inflation globally. This is something maybe it's not right now because it can affect the well-being of people. But of course, removal of subsidies on fossil fuels is an incentive to send the right signals for climate action. Of course, we could also build capacity. So we can build our human and technical capacity to develop the appropriate concept notes and funding proposals. When funders make funding available, you need to prepare very detailed concept notes and proposals in accessing these climate grants. And in the region, we can build that capacity within our human capital so that we are able to develop these concept notes to go after these grants and actually access these climate financing funds out there. And lastly, we can, of course, explore new sources of finance. Through REDD+, the first speaker spoke about Guyana and its work in the forestry sector. So REDD+ provides financing in the land use and forestry sector when you preserve your forestry. And there's a whole range of issues in there as to how you go about accessing that funding. Of course, there's the loss and damage fund, most recently spoken about at COP27. As Dr. Charles said earlier, we're still not sure what this fund is going to look like, how we access it, how much funding is available, but it's something that's going to become hopefully available in the near future that we can access. And there are different other types of financial instruments, such as debt for climate swaps, green bonds, and blue bonds, all new financing instruments that we can tap into in the Caribbean as we seek to fight climate change. So thank you. That's the end of my presentation.
Thank you, Priya. And so I'll just quickly transition into my presentation as well. Okay, so I mean, one of the main arguments in the climate change discussion is decarbonization, right? Again, to a low carbon economy. And when positioned in the bigger space of economic development, the discussion really is how can we reposition economic development towards low carbon economic activity, especially as it relates to energy use, given that economies have developed and thrived on fossil fuel energy sources. And the view is that economic activity has to be transformed towards low carbon economic development. And if this transformation is going to be sustainable, then the private sector, being really the main driver of economic activity in every country, really needs to fully commit to this low carbon transition. In particular, private finance needs to be oriented or reoriented towards low carbon economic development. So in this short presentation, I will outline some of the mechanisms that are being used to increase private finance towards low carbon economic development and briefly discuss applicability to the Caribbean region. Specifically, I will touch on carbon pricing, which Dr. Burley had discussed early in the forum. So I'll touch on that as a policy-based tool, and then I'll mention green bonds as well as green investment banks as more direct financing tools. Green investment banks especially, I think, have the ability to bring institutional enablement to a low carbon transition. Now, carbon pricing is probably the most commonly articulated policy tool used to address emissions. Major concern there in the literature is how effective is it, which Dr. Burley alluded to earlier in the forum. It's typically argued as being a very cost-effective in its design, especially when you compare it to traditional rules-based regulatory instruments. And the idea behind carbon pricing is to put a price or a cost on emissions, which then captures the negative externality associated with those emissions. And then this is supposed to then lead to more socially, environmentally efficient resource allocation, at least as it relates to emissions output. So carbon pricing increases the costs associated with emissions intensive economic goods and services, which is then expected to reduce demand for those goods and services and incentivize substitution towards low carbon based goods and services, which over time, the expectation is that they should lead to a more low carbon focused economy. Carbon pricing falls into two broad categories. You have carbon taxes and you have cap and trade systems. A carbon tax puts a direct price on emissions output, usually a price per ton of CO2 equivalent, while a cap and trade system sets a cap on the total amount of emissions level, and then you allow entities to sell allowances if they are below the cap, and they can sell to companies that have emissions levels above the cap. Now, the literature on carbon pricing, it's quite extensive, so this outline here doesn't really even begin to scratch the surface. And really the effectiveness of a carbon tax or a cap and trade system really depends on different economic and institutional parameters, which depending on any particular country, it may lead to either a carbon tax being more favorable or a cap and trade system being more favorable. In general, however, carbon taxes well, they tend to be less complex to design and implement relative to cap and trade systems, which is really their main advantage. At the tax policy, however, they can be politically unfavorable. And I think Dr. Burley would have mentioned the contention surrounding the Australia carbon tax back in, I think, 2012, 2011, thereabouts. Cap and trade systems provide some certainty on emissions reduction since the emissions levels are set under a cap and trade system. But in both cases, there is a critical uncertainty. For a carbon tax, there is uncertainty on the emissions level. So the emissions tax is set, but how much emissions will be achieved, well, that is unknown. And for a cap and trade system, there is price uncertainty. So the emissions levels are set, but then there is no way to know the price of tradable allowances and how expensive this might be. It is important to note that in several countries, however, there is both carbon tax and cap and trade systems. So these are definitely not an either or type of decision, certainly not mutually exclusive. Carbon pricing policies have been increasing across the world. However, I'm not aware of any Caribbean countries with a carbon pricing policy. Furthermore, I mean, I would argue that there are probably more critical climate change issues for the region than a carbon pricing policy. Dr. Burley would have alluded to whether or not these policies are actually effective. And there's actually quite the literature on carbon pricing, it's kind of up in the air in terms of the efficacy, especially to achieve the sort of emissions reductions that need to be achieved within the timelines that have been stated. And furthermore, Dr. Douglas would have mentioned about trying to align local policies to our local needs and our local solutions, and whether or not carbon policy will actually, I guess, provide those outcomes that we desire. Well, I'm not so sure. Furthermore, I would argue that there are more critical climate change issues for the region than really a carbon pricing policy. I would even further argue that without important support policies, a price on carbon might simply just translate into some sort of added business level. So while a carbon policy may create an incentive to move towards low carbon activity, the ability to actually move in that direction may be limited if the technologies, the business models, and even the financial capital needed to support that transition is just not available. So in the short term, at least, carbon pricing, in my opinion, may not be a desirable direction for the Caribbean. Now, one of the more important support parameters for low carbon development is financing. And Dr. Mohan had just mentioned the cost associated with some of these NDCs. And more importantly, the source, where these financing going to come from. And so one of the big issues in the climate financing space is how to attract private finance. And the idea is to reduce reliance on public funds, which are already constrained, certainly within our spaces. Green bonds are one financing instrument that has been used to raise funds on the capital markets, and then direct those funds to climate or environmental related projects. And green bonds are no real different from traditional bonds beyond the use of the proceeds. So the proceeds must go towards identifiable green projects. They do, however, tend to carry a little bit higher administrative costs due to the need to appropriately select projects that can be funded with the green bond. And then there's a monitoring and evaluation that is required to ensure that the funds are being used appropriately. That being said, green bond issuances have been increasing substantially over the last decade or so, and there is some precedence for their use in the Caribbean. Green bonds were issued in Barbados twice in 2019. $4 million Barbadian dollar issue, and then again in 2021, a $14 million Barbadian dollar issue. And in both cases, they were issued by the same company, which is a company that used the proceeds to distribute and install solar panel installations. Now, while the capital markets in the Caribbean tend to be small, I do think that there is room for green bond issuances, which may also help local or regional investors or portfolio managers who are seeking ESG exposure, which is another growing area in the space of climate change and climate financing. The next and final financing tool is green investment banks, to which I'll admit I'm a bit partial. And these are basically streamlined development financing institutions that focus on attracting private financing to low carbon investments by aiming to try and reduce the barriers that impede private capital from entering those low carbon investment spaces. Several green investment banks exist across the world, both at the national as well as at the subnational levels. And there are also others that are currently in development or being proposed. Most exist as self-contained entities, typically as government corporations that are operated by independent board of directors. But there are a few that are subsidiaries of larger entities, and some others are divisions within a larger organization. Now, regardless of their structure, though, they all serve the same purpose, which is to drive low carbon financing, in particular, to drive private capital towards low carbon financing. Green investment banks in particular have the ability to do a lot more than just provide financing. They can provide institutional support for policy enablement, for low carbon capacity building, a lot of which is needed, as Dr. Mohan had mentioned in her presentation. In many countries, they have also been used to support emissions reductions policy and to develop low carbon transition agendas, which is a very important space needed in the Caribbean, in my opinion. An important part of what they do is to design and develop financing mechanisms to support low carbon financing, especially from private capital. More developed GIBs have also been able to in-house project financing expertise for low carbon projects, which they can then bring to projects that they actually fund. So they not only bring financing, but they also bring technical expertise as well. GIBs are also useful in developing and emerging economies to build international partnerships with existing climate financing institutions, through which they can then be used to leverage funding and technical expertise that will further scale up the sort of low carbon economic transformations that are needed in these spaces. GIBs, I think, could also bring great value to the region. They can certainly be established as standalone entities. The major issue there is finding the funds needed to capitalize these entities, and especially given that many of the countries in the Caribbean are already fiscally constrained. I have argued that particularly in Trinidad and Tobago, the Green Fund could actually be reoriented to serve such a purpose for a Trinidad and Tobago Green Investment Bank. For other parts of the region, I think existing developing banks could actually create divisions with a GIB-like mandate. This has been done in a few other countries. For example, the New York Green Bank, which is a very notable green investment bank, is a division of an already existing New York State corporation. There's also a California Green Investment Banking-like entity, which is a division of an existing California Infrastructure and Development Bank. And I think both the Caribbean Development Bank and the Jamaica Development Bank, as development banks in the region, could create divisions that are specifically focused on low carbon development and additionally aim to attract private capital towards projects and build out such a division with a sort of GIB type framework. Now, with the GIB-like divisions, both the Caribbean Development Bank and the Jamaica Development Bank can attract private capital seeking exposure to low carbon projects and direct this capital to those low carbon investments. Furthermore, these divisions in both organizations can then focus on the roles that GIBs tend to champion, which is designing financing instruments that can support private capital flows to low carbon projects, enabling low carbon policy development, and building important international partnerships that will further aid local and regional low carbon development. For these reasons, I think GIBs in particular have much value to give to the region's low carbon agenda. So in conclusion, I think carbon pricing may be a more distant policy instrument for the Caribbean region, but for green bonds and green investment banks, however, I think there is definitely implementation scope for both, with some precedents being established in Barbados. And with that, I'll end my presentation, which brings us to the end of the 5 presentations. So now we will open up the question and answer section to the audience. So I guess as the questions come in, I might just throw one out to Dr. Bailey. So one of the, I guess, issues you mentioned was the effectiveness of, or at least the lack of effectiveness of carbon pricing. But so much of it seems to be so well articulated as this sort of almost first principled sort of policy towards emissions reductions. So what is actually driving this popularity for carbon pricing, given that the effectiveness seems to be so questioned?
Well, it's not effective. That's a fact. So we have to live with that reality. But as I tried to describe, the reason why it's so popular is that it's a simple solution to a complex problem, which we humans like. We don't like complexity. It seems to have a moral compass. The issue of climate change is dreadfully unfair, as my fellow speakers have pointed out, especially in the Caribbean, that did not contribute to this problem and yet is suffering the horrific consequences. There was, Dr. Charles was talking about solidarity And the problem is there is no solidarity. There is no solidarity. And that's the, you know, I feel like I'm the cynic on the panel, and maybe you always need one. But hopefully, you know, the bad news is carbon pricing doesn't work. The bad news is I don't think it's going to work in the short run because of human nature. The good news is that that doesn't mean that the Caribbean cannot both adapt and mitigate the effects of climate change. It absolutely can. And I actually don't think it's primarily a financing issue. You know, I've worked at, you were talking, Dr. Stewart, about green development banks. I mean, the World Bank and the IDB, where both places where I've worked have lent hundreds of millions of dollars to the Caribbean over the years, which could have been used for various climate mitigation and adaptation policies, which are essentially development policies. That is good development. So I think that while we can despair that this is tremendously unfair and that the rich countries who caused the problem should be fixing it, and I absolutely certainly believe that, I'm also a realist. You know, we can have good disaster risk management policies. The second speaker, Dr. Douglas, has a ream of policies that could be conducted right now, and governments could change their regulations. There's no reason why, when I go to visit my brother in St. Lucia and there is a hurricane, that people die. There is no reason why that should be happening, why his neighbors should be lose their houses in mudslides. There are policies that can be adopted by governments right now that don't require extra financing, that could absolutely mitigate and adapt to climate threats. So that's really my message, is one of realism in terms of all of these up in the air, beautiful solutions. You know, Paris Agreement has been broken, as we saw. Guyana, yes, it has a low carbon development strategy, but it's exploiting its oil wealth. The low carbon development strategy is a piece of paper that doesn't bear any reality. Belize, on the other hand, moved its capital city to higher ground. That's an example of really bold public policy that is going to save lives and doesn't require a development bank or a green bond. I do like green bonds. We can talk more about that. But yeah, so my message is basically that governments themselves, the people of the Caribbean themselves, unfortunately, are going to have to save themselves, because the international community, the rich countries, have proven singularly unsuited to this challenge, and they have not shown the levels of solidarity that we would have hoped. And it's my fear that actually that's going to get worse, because there really aren't any low risk countries. Every country in the world is going to suffer from some climate effect. Sorry, that's really, I'm sounding like that lady from that film, aren't I? That lady who shouts that but hopefully there's a nugget there of hope.
Yeah, and certainly
I stopped talking.
I see. Yeah. Oh, thanks for the response. I think certainly what I've seen in literature on carbon pricing, there are authors and researchers that do agree with you that certainly, at least as a first best solution, it's probably not going to be sufficient to achieve some of these emissions reductions that are needed to meet the some of these deadlines that they have from the Paris Agreement.
Yeah.
So I guess to the audience, just post your questions in the comment. I'm not seeing any activity at the moment. So I guess I'll just throw out another question to Priya. I noticed in your presentation, I was just looking at some of the NDC figures, the costs themselves, and also some of the emissions without energy targets. And I mean, beyond ambitious, they do seem quite lofty. Do you think that these are actually feasible and achievable, particularly given the 2030 deadline that a lot of these countries have set, or some of these anyways?
So I think the point of having these NDCs is to have very ambitious, lofty adaptation and mitigation goals. If you don't have these goals, these ambitious goals, then how are you going to attract the international climate finance to carry out these goals? At the same time, I want to speak more, not just on international climate finance or climate finance alone to carry out these goals, but there's also a need for capacity building in the region if we are to carry out these goals. We do need to build that capacity, that kind of technical support to carry out the studies that we need to determine our plans as to where we want to go and the policy direction. And we do have academics in the region like Dr. Douglas, Dr. Charles, yourself, and me to some extent, where we are doing the work. But of course, we need to build that capacity, especially in the public sector, in the ministries, in the institutions, whether it's institutions that deal with natural disasters and the environment, etc. So building that capacity is also very important, along with the issue of financing these goals. Yes, back to your question, they are ambitious. They need to be ambitious, and in every 5-year cycle, they are going to become more ambitious. We need to ramp up our action and chase behind them. It's always good to aim high and fall a little bit low than to aim low and meet that target.
Indeed. And you mentioned that the financing just thus far has been limited to these countries, but the financing that has been allocated so far, do you think that they are going the right places as well? Because often, particularly with these multilateral development funds, they tend to be earmarked to particular projects, and not always the case that the solutions that we desire are actually aligned to what a lot of these institutions might be funding. So for the limited finance that has been going to these countries so far, do you think that they're going to the right places?
So I want to make a correction to my own use of the limited financing from the multilateral development banks and bilateral partners. Dr. Briley brought this into the conversation with her comments. Yes, I do argue that the finance is limited, but to some extent we do receive financing in the Caribbean, and we often do not actually execute those finance on the climate projects themselves. So yes, while the financing is low, because we see that it's just about 3% over the period 2010 to 2015 as to what we really require, a lot of times the commitments are being made by the Multilateral Development Bank. They are being made by our bilateral development partners. But we, as Caribbean people, as Caribbean governments, institutions, we often find difficulties in executing the projects in a way that we can efficiently use the finance that we do receive. And this is why I recommend certain issues such as budgetary tracking, for instance, so that we become more transparent and accountable to our donors when they give us grant financing. We need to do our part in holding ourselves accountable as to how we use that monies going forward.
Thank you. I do see one question popping up here. Barbados is the first Caribbean SID that will access the IMF's Resilience and Sustainability Fund, which was designed to provide concessional finance to middle-income countries. Can any of the panelists comment on the suitability of this Resilience and Sustainability Fund to help Caribbean SIDs tackle their climate challenges? So I guess both, well, anyone who would like to address can go ahead and address.
I think I will start off mainly because I was actually asked to comment on this yesterday on national television, and Barbados is where I reside as well. I think the external financing that is available, whichever country can access it, I'd say take it. But I think what is more important is having a really high-level strategy for the expenditure of it, so you can have maximum impact for every dollar that is spent. And again, it comes back to the point I made in terms of if you're going to invest in anything, invest in something that will have multiple impact, not just a single impact. because that stretches that dollar for dollar value that you have just acquired. I know within Barbados that will be put towards the adaptation and climate adaptation and climate mitigation, but that is not the only funding that Barbados has actually attracted. And actually part of a project is called the 3R Cruise. This particular project is with the National Water Supply and Distribution Company, and they have one existing project, the WSRNS, which is for water. It basically is going to make water distribution and water infrastructure more resilient to climate change. And that was about $30 million that was acquired through 5Cs from the GCF, the Global Climate Fund. And this second project was, I think it was recently advertised in the news. It was $40 million, and that is 80 million Barbados dollars. So that is in tandem with all the other financing. But again, all this financing is all well and good. But do you have a plan? Do you have a strategy on how best to do it? Barbados is looking in the 3R Cruise program of reusing wastewater and also implementing some of the strategies that I mentioned in my presentation. It was just kind of coincidental that we were developing this, and then the project was actually being financed for this. So we've been asked to be a part of this particular project, taking our wastewater, our sewage, and actually rectifying it. We're using the actual wastewater, purifying it to a certain level, and then we injecting it down into our underground aquifers so that we can retain the water that we have on the island. Because again, it comes back to the vulnerabilities of trade and tourism especially, because as you increase your tourism activity, your water usage is going to increase. And that occurs in the peak season, which is really the winter season, which for Barbados is really our dry season. So where the water resource levels are pretty, then you're going to have a balance of actually personal safety with wildfires. You have to protect people, but also property. And so you have all these competing demands for a very limited natural resource, which is water. And so you have to be very crafty, you have to be very intentional in terms of your policy design and also your strategy of how you are going to incrementally build it, because I don't believe in Caribbean country will in one fell swoop solve all the problems. You have to have a step-by-step strategy that you want to put in place.
Thank you, Dr. Douglas. And from what I've seen, Barbados certainly is pressing ahead with a very strong climate change agenda. I think even recently I saw that they are looking to establish what might be the first Caribbean GID-like entity, the Barbados Blue-Green Investment Corporation. So they certainly are pressing ahead with some very good climate change policies. Now I see there's another question. It appears that insurance premiums are computed on risk. Why isn't there a polluter component included in computing the premium? As a comparison, if two clients insure identical vehicles, the premium will include the driving record of the owners as well. So including levels of pollution would penalize high polluters. And I see Don wants to take up that one. You're muted.
That's an excellent question. I saw the question was posted by someone in the chat. So they are quite accurate. Insurance premium, we could see that at a micro level, insurance premium. So let's say a car insurance or housing insurance is often computed on the basis of risk. But in the context of let's say a parametric insurance or a macro insurance, where it's a water insurance, well, the risk in context of water insurance is the probability of likelihood of the unfortunate event occurring. So in the context of our weather insurance could be like the probability of, like, let's say a storm, a tropical cyclone, or maybe if you're looking in the US, it might be the probability of like even stuff like a hurricane is occurring. And I want to make mention to a point made by Dr. Bailey, and she's saying, and she made the mention that in reality, no country is really immune, and every country really have some kind of risk of climate change, because climate change is occurring. And for some countries, it's going to manifest, like, let's say, hurricanes, that's like in the Caribbean. For some countries, it might manifest in the form of drought. Some countries are going to manifest, like, it's manifesting in the form of sea level rise, and let's say coastal erosion and so forth. Then, so really and truly, climate change is occurring, and it's affecting all countries, differently. Hence the reason why we have a whole context of a whole argument of common but differentiated responsibility. In the context of insurance, this insurance should be constructed on the basis of solidarity. And why I say solidarity is because we have some countries, like let's say we look at an extreme weather event like a hurricane. We have some countries and have a high, and like an example, like let's say Dominica or St. Lucia or Grenada, the Eastern Caribbean countries. There's a high probability that in any given year, or like let's say over a 5-year period, that at least one of these countries will be impacted by an extreme weather event. Now, usually when you have an insurance with structured on the basis of risk, the economic agents or the policy holders that have a high risk tend to pay high premiums, and whereby the policy holders that have a lower risk will pay lower premiums. We do not want to penalize the countries that have a high risk of experiencing the extreme weather event to pay a high premium. We want to have a system whereby we want to spread the risk amongst all the countries in the pool. So I acknowledge the whole point where where the person was saying that they want to have a polluter component. And how I interpreted the polluter component was like from the polluter pays principle, in the sense that we have some countries are high emitting countries, but we have some countries that are low emitting countries. The Caribbean countries are relatively low emitting countries, but they have a high risk in terms of high likelihood of the event occurring. What I was thinking is spreading the risk among the pool. So ideally, you need to get a large pool of countries. So the CCRF was only 19 Caribbean countries. We want to get a pool that is larger than 19 countries, way larger. They're looking at a pool like maybe about 40, even 50, or even more countries. So you want to spread the risk among a large number of countries in the pool. And of course, we have different name perils. So you could look at, let's say, excess rain, excess wind, and so forth, different name perils. And we want to structure this in a way that when the extreme weather event occurs, or when trigger occurs, it will trigger the payment to different policy holders, and they can be able to file a claim and receive a payout that will compensate them for the occurrence of the extreme weather event. So, I mean, we do not want to structure the insurance in a way where it will penalize in countries. We want to structure the insurance in a way that will facilitate cross-subsidization amongst the countries in the pool. So hence the reason why this proposed insurance framework should not really be charging premiums based on the risk or likelihood of the event occurring. It should be charging a premium that is independent of the risk of the countries.
Thanks, Don. And I saw Dr. Bailey wanted to add something.
I just wanted to respond to my illustrious colleagues. I think earlier Dr. Douglas was mentioning neocolonialism. And I think it's quite important if I can give sort of like a final message that's not too depressing, that there is a language around climate change. We talk about the donors and the recipients, which I hate using that language. I try to say, rich countries who cause this problem are giving a little bit of money to mitigate and adapt. And the people I used to work for at the World Bank were my clients. They certainly weren't the recipients. But in that regard, what Dr. Mohan said about reaching high, it really resonated with me. And I think it's correct that we should reach high in Caribbean countries, while acknowledging that nobody from outside is going to save us magically. There also is a great capacity that we even see on this panel. There's a brain trust and there's a civil society that must push the development banks and push governments to ensure that money is implemented properly. So again, I of course, this is a money issue in some regards, and there needs to be more concessional financing. And there is the issue that Caribbean countries are middle income. But in my 20-year career, it's not been a lack of money that's been the problem. It's been on the implementation and design side. We've seen today that we have so many good policy ideas. We have so much talent in the Caribbean. Barbados is exciting to me. I think Mia Motley is amazing. She's trying to diversify away from tourism. So that does give me hope. So I hope we leave this conversation with hope and understanding this kind of academic brain trust that can push the right policies, monitor implementation, monitor the money that the development banks are throwing at the Caribbean. That is going to be the key. It's quite boring work. It's not cool and sexy green bonds and carbon financing, but good climate change adaptation and mitigation is basically good development. That's
Agreed,
it.
totally agreed.
That's what I had to say. Thank you for listening.
Yep. And I guess we can, we have 5 minutes, so we can just, oh, sorry, go ahead, Dr. Douglas.
Yeah, I just wanted to echo the sentiments of Dr. Burley and also the other fellow panelists. I think that there's no silver bullet, and we cannot expect, next in China army to come to our rescue. We have to formulate our own solutions. We're quite capable of it. And we've seen from time to time, from generation to generation within the Caribbean, where persons within the Caribbean rise to the occasion. And so I don't think that this is anything different. I think what we need is a concerted effort, a collective effort. As again, as I reiterated from the very beginning, this is not only a solution for government to come up with, but this is collectively together, the university, the government, but also the private sector. And this is where I think there is room for improvement in terms of stimulating and exciting the private sector to such a degree that they will want to join this. And this is part also of the corporate structure. We'll see probably within a year or two the launch of UN Global Compact. Now, this is an arm of the UN agency that is responsible for sustainability in the private sector. It's all intents and purposes voluntary, but what's happening in terms of the business environment, a lot of companies in the Caribbean are also owned by Europe or European American companies. And so within their whole corporate structure, ESG is going to be featured. And also they have to be reporting as it relates to sustainability. So this is not going to be encapsulated in the behavior of the business. And so we must take opportunity of how to frame that in such a way that, again, shifting this paradigm away from waste and also emissions as being something punitive and being something onerous, and seeing how we can actually flip that paradigm and actually get revenue generated. Because if we are honest with ourselves, the sector is in it for profit at the end of the day. And so we have to align their interests with what we want holistically, which is for a clean environment. And I believe that the two are not necessarily separate, but they can coexist. And so that is where we have to find that sweet spot in terms of policy, in terms of action. How can we bring everybody to the table so that we all are in the same direction?
Thank you very much, Dr. Douglas. And I guess as a last question, we can take this one. Caribbean SIDs are among the most highly indebted SIDs worldwide. Part of the region's debt buildup is linked to funding recovery and reconstruction efforts in the aftermath of hurricanes. What are some of the options for Caribbean SIDs to deal with this debt climate trap? I think some of this would have been echoed in quite a few of the arguments that were presented. I mean, certainly, I think one of the big issue for it is to try and institutionalize mechanisms that can actually bring private capital into the fore. I think public finances will continue to be constrained for a long time to come, and I think to finance these efforts going forward, somehow there has to be some need or some ability to bring in private finance into the climate change agenda. But I'll also put it to the panel and they can address it as their, I guess, their last response for the forum.
I'll just
Go
respond
ahead,
very
Don.
quickly.
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Priya.
Sorry, Don, but it does involve your work. I mean, some of the solutions have been presented today. Once a disaster hits, we need access to immediate financing for relief and reconstruction. The key word is immediate. In the region, we do have the CRIF, which allows for that type of payment to become immediate. And Don has presented his loss and damage insurance, which he can speak to. But also we have the natural disaster clause in Barbados. And this disaster clause allows the country to actually free up as much as 15% of the economy's GDP once a disaster strikes. So this is something that can be adopted across the region so that we do have that kind of fiscal space to react once a disaster strikes. And I'll end it there. Thank you, everyone.
Go ahead, Don.
Yes, I'm very grateful for such a question. It actually reminds me of work that I did previously for ECLAC. That's what I was working there up to the year 2019. So we was dealing with this whole issue with ECLAC when I was looking at the Caribbean debt is high, in the sense that we have a lot of countries where the debt to GDP ratio is over 100% of GDP. We have several countries that are frequently being affected and being impacted by hurricanes and extreme weather events and so forth. And what ECLAC was proposing to actually address this whole debt climate change nexus was a debt swap, in the sense that we try to see or try to look for a climate finance donor, like perhaps like the Green Fund, and try to see to what extent, like let's say the multinational climate fund, or in this context, the Green Fund, will be willing to engage in a debt swap, whereby they purchase the debt from the different Caribbean governments, most likely at a haircut. And this money will be used to offset the debt, and also the Caribbean governments will receive some form of debt forgiveness and exchange the debt service payments that they previously would have allocated to, let's say, the lenders, their creditors. This money will be then be used to finance.
I think we may have lost Dr. Charles. But I think the essence of what he was getting to are these debt for climate swaps arrangements, which I had seen proposed, I think 2 years ago by the World Bank and the IMF, but they just sort of fell off the agenda. I don't know what happened. But I do think there is a scope for some sort of instrument like that to address the climate change while, I guess, being address climate change while also being relevant to the high debt burdens that we have, particularly in this region. So with that being said, I think we're at the end of the forum. And I'll just like to thank all the panelists, Dr. Emily Beerley, Dr. Kirk Douglas, Dr. Don Chal, Dr. Priya Mohan. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your presentation. I found all the presentation were quite insightful. Hope the audience enjoyed it as well. And I will say that all 5 presentations, there were quite a bit of intersections in the content. So I think there's certainly the possibility for collaboration amongst the panel going forward as we address some of these critical issues, particularly for our region. So again, thank you all for attending. Thanks to the audience, and certainly thanks to all the organizers that worked in the background to make this happen. The marketing and communication teams for the University of the West Indies, also the administrative team in the SALISES St. Augustine campus. Thanks to everyone, and do have a great Christmas season. Bye.
Thanks very much. Bye. Take care.